Hello and welcome to the La Jolla Presbyterian Church Women's Bible Study for February 14th, 2018. It's Valentine's Day and Ash Wednesday. Today we are in chapter 20 of the story. Cynthia Blaze is our teacher and looking at the book of Esther. Thank you for listening and have a great day.
Good morning, ladies. I'm so glad you all are here. Happy Valentine's Day. This is a day, that we so often focus on romantic love, but I think it's very appropriate and very fitting to talk about, obviously, the greatest love, which is Christ's love for us. And no matter where you are or who you are today or what status of romantic love is in your life, the most important thing is to know that we are all loved, right? By the greatest, deepest, most wonderful love, and that no romantic love can really actually ever fulfill, the heart's cry that we all have to be loved, and that's really only fulfilled in Christ. So I thought it would be fitting to mention that today. I also, before we dive in, I wanted to mention just a couple things too. I had an awesome woman leave a bunch of these Beth Moore little cards in my box. So Beth Moore is coming to San Diego, and she's an amazing Bible teacher, obviously. I do want to give one little disclaimer, though. The very, very same weekend, our church is doing a couples retreat, and that weekend that is open to anyone. It's not just for young couples. And my husband and I will be going. I'm really excited for that. And so it's the last weekend in April 27th through 29th. And there's a couple, Casey and Megan, that run a ministry called Marriage 365, and they're going to be coming. And I actually got to spend all week at Forest Home with them last summer, and they're incredible. So if you would like to come to an awesome marriage weekend with your spouse and just really talk through things, no matter how long you've been married, I'd really encourage you to consider coming. And what's really fun is that because this retreat has multiple generations, people like me who have been married 11 years love hanging out with those of you who have been married a lot longer. It's really encouraging for us to see, couples who've been married significantly longer than we have. We think we're doing good at 11. Anyway, so I wanted to mention those two things briefly. And also then for our younger set too, just to mention also on February 23rd, we have our next Young Couples Night. And so if you have not gotten that invite, please let me know and I'll make sure you get invited to that. So just a couple times a year, we have sort of a young couples night at the church. It's really anyone in their 20s through 50s. It's funny because we like to joke about we're young, but my husband turns 50 this year and he has a 5-year-old. So, age is just kind of different now. So we still consider him young. All right. So let us dive in. I'm excited for this week. This week, we're going to be talking through the story of Esther. And actually, it seems much simpler in some ways than covering huge amounts of time and history and stuff like that. But I do want to, as I do every week, go through where we are in the story, just so that you ladies can get our context. Because, I always say, based on one of my seminary professors, he would say context is king. We have to know context to understand our story. And also, I did actually want to mention before diving in, so next week is our very last week in the Old Testament. So next week, and I'm excited for that. And then following that, we're going to be doing 10 weeks of the New Testament. Next week, I'm probably going to go a little bit off topic. We're going to be talking that week, it's going to be focused on, or according to the story, it's Ezra and it's rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And I'll probably cover that very, very briefly. But what I actually really want to do is I really want to use next week to set up are launching into the New Testament. So I am going to recap, as I always do, all of the Old Testament. I also want to look historically at what we call the intertestamental period, which is the 400 years after Malachi's prophecy before John the Baptist comes. So I just want to talk about historically what went on during that time period. And I also want to review and highlight some of the great messianic prophecies that are given by the prophets. So next week, we will kind of follow the story, but I think I really want to use next week to set up the New Testament. So also, I want to throw that out as an invitation invitation. If there's any of you who feel like you have a friend you would want to invite, starting next week would be a great time for 11 weeks, because I'll do one big recap of the Old Testament, and then we're going to launch into 10 weeks of the New Testament. So if you feel like there's any friend that has been kind of asking, what is this Bible all about? What is the story? What did Jesus really teach? What is the church? This would be a great time to invite them to either come or to listen in to the podcast. I'm kind of excited for this next launch that we have coming up. But today we get to do Esther, and Esther is a great story of a great woman, and that's always really fun. So again, just thinking through how did we get here? How did we get to the story of Esther? I've told you lately, I feel like we need to begin thinking of the Old Testament according to time periods. So first we had the time period of creation, right? God reaching out and establishing a relationship with people. And through this, we get the fall, and we get sin, and we get the sense through the prophecy that God has a secret rescue plan to renew the relationship between his people. And that's going to come through an offspring of Eve. And then we get into the patriarchs, where God reaches out and establishes his covenant, right? And we get that covenant first established with Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, then passed on to the fourth son of Jacob, Judah. And we get our three pieces of our covenant, right? We get the three P's. You can yell them out if you want to. Progeny, yes, progeny. Offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky. Second place, the land of Canaan is our everlasting inheritance. And then what's the last one? Promise, that greater promise that all the nations on the earth will be blessed through this offspring of Abraham. And then we get famine, Egypt, slavery, but God has a plan, right? And then we get Moses, and then we enter into our third period, which is Exodus and desert journey. And we go through that period where we get the tabernacle, we get God leading his people in a daily relationship with manna and quail. We get the 10 Commandments established. The law is good. And that's all that desert journey. And then we go into the fourth period, which is entering and occupying Canaan. Now, Joshua's in command, and that God wants to create this sacred space, a separate space for the people of Israel to thrive, and that they need to kick out all of the idolatrous nations that are there. And they kind of fail to do that. So under Joshua, Canaan is mostly conquered, but not entirely conquered. And we move into the period of the judges, where now they occupy Canaan, but who's leading them? And we have these different people that are raised up to lead them for periods of time, but there's no central government. And it's really a time of chaos during that time period. So then that next period, 6, is a united monarchy. After all this disorder and disunity, they crave order. They ask for a king. And in this period, we get Saul and David and Solomon, and we get our great building campaign, and we get our palace and Jerusalem and temple and walls, that all period, 80 years of our united monarchy. And then we go into 7th period, which is divided monarchy. That after Solomon, his son Rehoboam makes a really bad decision, and the 10 tribes, northern tribes, split off. So we have 10 tribes to the north now and 2 to the south. And from here, we have the 2 kingdoms, and at this time period, and the books of Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings evaluate all these kings, whether they are faithful or whether they are not. And during this time period, we also get the great prophets, the prophets calling them back to faithfulness. And this is the time we also get a lot of our messianic prophecies, because what the prophets would do is they would prophesy for the immediate future, but also for this distant future up ahead. And because their prophecies would come true in the immediate future was why they were saying, you can trust us for the future, and that this great king is going to be coming. And then at that period, we talked about that they talk about a new king and a new kingdom. And then 8th, next period is exile. First, Israel goes into exile, then Judah. That's kind of where we've been the last weeks. And then we get that 3 stages of deportation for Judah, where first, so Nebuchadnezzar visits Jerusalem 3 times, and it's finally on that 3rd time that Jerusalem is sacked, as the city is burned, the temple is destroyed. But we get, for that period, we also get the great prophet Jeremiah, and he talks about this exile will be 70 years, that a future greater king and a new covenant is coming, which involves changed hearts. And that's what we see in Jesus, a changed heart. So, and that from the line of Judah will come a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely. And in the new covenant, and that there will be a new covenant where God will write his law on our hearts, no longer on the doorposts, but on our hearts. And that God's relationship with his people will no longer be mediated by a high priest, but that everyone will know God from the least to the greatest. And then the best part of this new covenant is that God says he will no longer remember the sins of his people. And so during that period of the exile, we also get those great stories of Daniel and his friends. And then finally, last week, we went to the ninth and final of the Old Testament, which is return and rebuilding. So after these 70 years of exile, now Cyrus the Great in 539, he rules over Judah from 539 to 530 BC, and he makes this what's called the Edict of Cyrus, where he allows the people of Judea to return to Israel, to return to the land of Israel. So he allows the Jews to return, and after him, two of his sons rule for short amounts of time, and then in this power vacuum, Darius I fights his way to the throne, and then following him is his son, Xerxes, is going to rule. And Xerxes is going to be the king that we're going to be talking about today. So today we're going to look at the story of what happened to the Jews who stayed in Babylon. So, and that's where the story of Esther picks up. So it's the Jews who stayed in Babylon while many had already returned to Judea. So this is our time period of return and rebuilding, but we're still in Babylon. So does that make sense? All right. So, and when we look at a book, I think it's so important to begin, of course, looking at context. I do this every week. And I think it's important to start with what I call internal evidence. What does the book say about itself? So just for the sake of that, let's open up to Esther 1, 1 through 2. And just begin looking at what does Esther say about itself for understanding its context. All right, Esther 1, 1 through 2. So this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes, he ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At the time King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. All right, so is an author identified in this opening passage? No, the author isn't identified. So most of the time when someone is very specific about writing a book, they identify themselves in the very, very first sentence of a book. So we'll see that a lot of times as we go into the New Testament, where he says, I, Paul, am writing this. So no author is identified. So that's actually important. And because of that, we don't exactly know who the author of Esther was for sure, because no one identifies himself. We know, what we kind of begin to know is that the author must have been a person familiar with Susa. This is the capital, one of the capital cities where our story is going to take place. Also must have been familiar with the royal palace and Persian customs. So whoever wrote this book was familiar with all those things. The Talmud, which is Hebrew writings that are non-biblical, sort of extra-biblical, it attributes the authorship to what they call the men of the great synagogue. So sort of anonymous still. But those were scholars in the 5th century. So about this time that the events are occurring. The early church fathers like Clement of Alexandria and Jewish authorities like Josephus have ascribed the book to Mordecai. So Mordecai is one of our characters that we're going to go through. So some people think Mordecai may have written it. So the answer is we don't really know exactly for sure. But what we do know is that the language of the book is very similar to language of other texts written at the time of these events were occurring, a time in the 5th century. So our assumption is that this book was written shortly after the events occurred. So that's kind of the most we know. But the text does tell us when do the events occur. So if we go back to Esther 1:1, it says, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes, right? The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces. So based on that, when did the events occur? You can just say it based on that text. During whose reign? Xerxes, right. So the events occurred during the reign of Xerxes. We get that. We know he reigned from 486 to 465 BC. So it says it's the third year of his reign. So these events occurred in 483 BC. So what I love about the Bible is it's very clear in these historical books about when things were happening and when it was occurring, and it makes us trust it. That these are literary books meant to be taken historically. So historical context, what is going on? So the decree of Cyrus was 538 BC. So that's actually 52 years earlier. So if you think 52 years before this story takes place is when Cyrus told the Jews they could return to Judea, to Palestine. So what we know is that some Jews stayed in Persia. And I kind of mentioned last week, if you had been living somewhere 70 years, then you may not necessarily want to return to wherever your forefathers were from. I mentioned last week that on my mom's side, that her family came over on the second boat to America on the Elizabeth, but my dad's family came over only my great-grandparents. So my grandparents were first generation born from Russia. And so I can imagine as a young child, if I had been told, okay, we're all going back to Russia, that would have been like the most odd thing because I was an American and I knew America. And so I kind of get that sense that they had lived somewhere 70 years. They might not necessarily want to go back to a broken city and broken walls and hostile territory. So it makes sense in my mind why many people did stay. So the temple is completed in 516 BC. So this is actually even 30 years after the temple has been completed. And it occurs in the capital city of Susa, which was one of the capital cities of Babylon. But what's most important is that it was the royal city. It was where the king and his entourage lived. So that's where our story is going to take place. When was it written? We don't really know, but the language is very similar to Daniel and Chronicles, which are all written in the 5th century BC. And so that's why we assume it was probably written about the same time. And then the audience, you ladies, I think you can guess. Who do you think the audience for this book was? Who was this book written to? You can guess. Yeah, the Jews. Exactly. It was written to the Jewish people living in exile. And original intent. Does anyone want to take a stab at what do you think the original intent? Why was this book written? Any thoughts on that? Welcome to just try.
Even though God's not directly mentioned in this, maybe that his care and love for his people is still there, even though it's not just.
Yeah. That's awesome. So even though God's not mentioned, that his care and his love, his protection, is still with the Jewish people. No, I think that's exactly right. One of the just very sort of practical reasons of writing this is Purim is one of the major Jewish holidays. And so this book explains where did Purim come from and why do we celebrate it. So that's one very practical reason. But I think you're actually absolutely right, Deborah, that it's also a reminder to the Jews that God is not absent, no matter where they live, no matter what country they're in. That God is still very involved in their lives. And that this book is included in both the Jewish and the Christian canons, which is what we consider the actual scriptures. And it's interesting because what Deborah mentioned is correct. God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, which is funny. But the sense of God, the working of God, we do see. But it's very interesting that God itself is never mentioned. And our pastor on Sunday did a little trivia. He said, does anybody know what was the one other book that God is not mentioned in? And I was like, I don't know. I couldn't come up with it myself. So I don't know if any of you are here. Any of you know? Song of Solomon is the only other book that God is not mentioned in. So that was a good little trivia fact for me. Okay, biblical context, where does this book fall in the Bible? 17th. I put this little handout on your tables again. I just think it's awesome for looking at, did you all get this on some of your tables? Okay, good. Yeah. I just think it's awesome for understanding how the Bible is grouped. Because I remember I've talked about that the Bible, the Old Testament is grouped by genre and not by linear order, not by chronology. So first we have the law, then books of history, then we have the books of poetry, then the major prophets and the minor prophets. So right now we're at the very last book of our history section, Esther. So you can see it. Oh, it didn't get passed out. Sorry. All right. Coming around now. All right. Coming around. So you can look. So Esther is the very end of our historical section. Okay. And then genre, what kind of writing is this? You can probably guess. What would you ladies say? What kind of writing? Historical. Awesome. And then language is primarily written in Hebrew. A few portions are written in Aramaic, primarily Hebrew. So today we're going to look at the story of Esther. She's a woman placed in a position of power to save her people. And starting with, let's just ask, how did Esther become queen? So I'm going to start our story going back again, Esther 1, and we will skip through this portion, and I will just let you know where I'm going. But starting with Esther 1:1. So this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. Xerxes, he ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. At the time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. I'm going to skip over to verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, I'm just going to skip over all their names, verse 11, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. So now he is going to consult some of his advisors and say, what should I do? This woman has disobeyed me. So going into verse 16. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. Then there will be no end to disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. Okay, so context. So now we're at 482 BC, 3rd year of his reign, royal feast. Xerxes gives one feast for the men. Queen Vashti gives another for the women. So apparently the men and women dined separately. I tried going through a lot of historical documents and things like that to see if I could find any information about that. But pretty much all that I found was that when men drank a lot, it was sort of considered a little bit dishonorable for women to be around them because maybe their behavior. So anyway, so they dined separately. But so according to verse 3, who was at the king's feast? So verse 3, who was at the king's feast? Everyone important, good. So the nobles, the officials, military leaders, princes, everyone. So King Xerxes asked for Queen Vashti to come. Why? Why does he want her to come into? To show her off. Apparently she's gorgeous, and he wants to show her off. Does Vashti come in? No. Okay, so this is why. I was like, why? So I tried reading through a lot of commentaries to see if I could find any information. Why? Why would she not come in? Some have said that maybe it was that she was supposed to wear only her crown. But really, there's no biblical or cultural evidence to support that. But that's what some people have said. Women, what's interesting in Persia is women were not just secluded behind walls. They ran businesses, they owned property. Their picture wearing like a very small veil or no veil at all. So women were very active in Persian society at this point, which is awesome. But we get the sense that somehow this demand dishonored Vashti in some way. Some way this demand for her to come, she felt dishonored by it. So BibleGateway.com wrote, Plutarch, who was a historian, reminds us that it was the habit of a Persian king to have his queen beside him at a banquet. But when he wished to riot and drink, he sent his queen away and called in the wives of inferior rank, his concubines. Perhaps that is the historic clue to Vashti's indignant refusal, for she knew only too well the Persian custom dictated that a queen be secluded during the feast where rare wines flowed freely. So that's possible sort of understanding. My Bible has sort of a note at the bottom that said that Herodotus, a Greek historian of the Persian period, writes in a less than flattering terms about Xerxes as a very impatient, easily angered ruler who had a widespread reputation as a voracious womanizer. So not a great reputation, this king. So whatever the reason, Vashti refuses. Somehow she feels very dishonored by this request at this drunken party and does not come. And So Xerxes gets super mad, and he consults all of his advisors, and they say, get rid of her and find a new queen. So that's going to set our context for he's going to need a new queen. What's going to happen next? So it's interesting that why do the advisors say that that he essentially sort of needs to discipline Vashti? What are they afraid of? What are they afraid of? Yes, influencing all the women. That setting an example that other women would be disrespectful to their husbands. So, which I do 100% believe that women should be respectful to their husbands. So I will say that for the record. Following this, a search is made throughout the kingdom for beautiful women. So, and then these women are going to be brought into the king's harem for 12 months and given beauty treatments. And one historical thing that I read said the first 6 months was sort of like a detox. Like they didn't really know where these women were coming from, even maybe what diseases they had. So it's kind of like a detox. And then the second 6 months were sort of a beauty and beauty rituals and rites to make these women like as beautiful as possible. So then they would appear before the king. So there's a great, you all know I love Veggie Tales. There's a great Veggie Tales about Esther. And they like pretty much show it as like a beauty pageant. Like all these little ladies coming through. It's really cute. So the Jewish, so we get it that there's a Jewish woman named Esther who's selected for this harem. So sort of like the queen tryouts is what it is. So let's read about who she was. Starting in Esther 2, verse 5. I'll pick it up. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shammai, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, who he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her 7 female attendants and selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants to the best place in the harem. All right, so we meet a man named Mordecai, a Jew living in Susa, the capital. It says that his great-grandfather was taken with who into exile? Jehoiakim. So Jehoiakim, this is on Nebuchadnezzar's second visit to Jerusalem when the king and all of the nobility just pretty much surrender. So his grandfather is taken to Babylon at that point. So that was 598 BC. He's taken, so now we're actually at 116 years later at this point in Persia. Mordecai, we believe, was from a wealthy family. We learned that Mordecai is raising his young cousin Hadassah. And why? Why is he raising her? She's an orphan. Exactly. Her parents have died. So Hadassah, who's called Esther, how is she described in verse 7? A good figure, beautiful, lovely. So Esther is taken into the harem because she's beautiful. There's a man, Haggai. He's in charge of the harem. And how does he feel about her? According to verse 9, what does it say? She pleases him, yes. So something about her conduct, her attitude wins his favor. And I was thinking that she could have been really bitter and sulky about this, right? I mean, when I read about Persian culture, it actually said that men and women were allowed to marry for love. It wasn't just that there was all these arranged marriages going on. So we don't know if she even had someone that she was in love with. We don't know what her status was, but pretty much she lost her freedom in this moment. She's taken into a harem. All that she knows is she can be called in by the king at his will. So she's really lost her own life at this point, her own freedom. So it seems that she is very positive and makes the best of this situation by the way she acts, by her conduct, by the way she is respectful to people. So, out of all of this, where is she elevated to, according to verse 9? What does it say? The best place in the harem. So something about her conduct, her attitude, she's elevated to the best place in the harem. So let's see what happens when Esther meets the king. So I'm picking up in verse 10. So Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. I'll skip over to verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So this is interesting because it's now the 7th year of his reign, right? So this all started in the 3rd year of his reign. So this has actually been like a 4-year process of him trying to find a new queen. And it's Esther. So it says that Esther wins the favor of everyone who sees her. The king is very attracted to her. And it says she wins his what? Favor and approval. So something about Esther was very winning. Now, Mordecai, her uncle, or her cousin, is going to uncover a plot against the king. And he's going to tell it to Esther. So let's read what happened there. So Esther 2, verse 21 through 23. So during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were impaled on poles. Lovely. All this was recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. Okay, so where does it say that Mordecai was sitting? The king's gate. So now this is actually, it was not the city gate, it was the king's gate, which I thought was interesting because I looked a little bit more into that. So what was the king's gate? It was actually a physical structure set a distance from the palace with a courtyard in between. So it's sort of like the first stop if you're going to try and go into the palace. You have the King's Gate. From a website called PersianThings.com, the gate was placed where all the place where all suppliants and petitioners waited for an appointment with the monarch. They were questioned by security here, and only after satisfying the guards were they admitted into the courtyard beyond. Here, messengers, including eunuchs, conveyed missives back and forth between the courtyard and the audience hall. And now the reason it said, I kind of skipped over the verse, but the reason that Mordecai comes to the gate often is he wants to check up on Esther. So he's constantly coming to this gate to check up on Esther to see what's going on. Historically, it shows that there was a huge statue of Darius I at the gate. So you can just imagine this very large gate, this huge statue there. And Mordecai would go to the gate to check on Esther. And so when he's there, he hears about this plot. He tells Esther the plotters are killed. And this is going to be part of sort of the drama of our story later. So we'll come back to this piece. So following this, we're introduced to a man named Haman. And Haman is given position over all of the other nobles, over all the other Persian nobles. So I'm going to pick up in chapter 3 in verse 2. Okay, so all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So the king has commanded that everyone has to bow down to this official Haman, but will Mordecai do it? No, he won't do it. And the royal officials even tried to persuade Mordecai, like, come on, buddy, just bow down. It's no big deal. But he won't do it. And so Haman finds out, learns that Mordecai is a Jew, and decides that he's not going to just destroy Mordecai, but who does he want to kill? All the Jews in Persia. So Haman is going to come up with, Haman comes up with a plan. Let's read about the plan. So chapter 3, verse 7. So now in the 12th year of King Xerxes, okay, so it's in the 7th year that Esther becomes queen, right? So now we're 5 years later. So in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month, and the lot fell in the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there's a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces and the nobles of the various peoples. They were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by the couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. I think it's worth noting that, remember, Judea is not its own country. It is still completely in the Persian Empire. So this would even affect Jerusalem, the exiles, all those that had returned, because they're still part of the Persian Empire. Okay, so we're in the 12th year, the first month. And so she's been queen, we decided, 5 years. She became queen in the 7th year. Haman cast a lot called a pur to determine when he should take action. So the lot falls on the 12th month. So his plan is going to be enacted 11 months later. So does that make sense? So we're in the first month. This plan is supposed to happen in the 11th month. So Haman presents this plan to the king right away that he wants to destroy all of the Jews. Now, the interesting is how he describes the Jews in verse 8. How do the Jews act? What does it say in verse 8 about them? They separate themselves. They keep themselves separate. That's actually what I noticed too, and says that they're different. So I think that's interesting because remember, during the period of the Jews, of the judges and the kings, our huge problem was what? It was assimilation, right? So now, somehow during this period of the exile, they're not assimilating. They're actually maintaining their own culture and their own customs. They're different. And I think that's a really interesting sort of historical development of the Jewish people. So the edict is sent out to the entire kingdom 11 months from now. Kill all your Jewish neighbors, take their stuff. Like, that's what it is. I mean, it actually kind of sounds weird, right? Like, the people of Susa are like, what? I mean, like, what if that were issued in our country right now? You know, like, I'm not going to name a certain people because it's just would be bad, but we can all think of people who are sort of minority groups, right? What if it was suddenly like, okay, 11 months from now, all of you kill all your neighbors of this descent and take all their stuff? Like, that's crazy. Like, you can imagine how these people were like, what? Like, that's weird. What was that? Yes, exactly. It's totally what Hitler did. Exactly. Possibly. I mean, that's a really good question. And the question was, were the Jews hated already? Because Esther doesn't say she's Jewish. I think that's really worth noting that, yes, there was a certain sense of they must have somewhat been underdogs, right? That's a really, really good point. And maybe it was that because they kept themselves separate and had their own customs and possibly. So Mordecai learns of the edict. He actually clothes himself in sackcloth and ashes and starts wailing outside the city gate. So Esther learns about this. She's like, what's up with my cousin? Sends one of her attendants out to find out what's wrong. So I'm going to pick up our story, Esther 4, 6 through 17. All right. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square. So she sends her messenger, Hathach, in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days had passed since I was called to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will go fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. All right, so what does Mordecai want Esther to do? Verse 8. What does he ask her to do? Intercede for the Jewish people. Exactly. Esther doesn't want to because there's some kind of law that if a person approaches the king without being summoned, what will happen to them? They die. Yes. So, but what does the king do if he wants to spare someone's life? What does he do? Extends his gold scepter to them. So you can just imagine his golden scepter he's holding would extend it forward. So the Bible, my Bible text notes that this was actually a defense against assassination. So nobody could come into his presence without being called in. They had to first request an audience from the king. So Mordecai thinks Esther isn't acting because she thinks she's safe being a part of the royal palace. I feel like I respond this way sometimes, like it doesn't affect me, like I think that's a very human, like natural response. I'm not affected. I'm not going to do anything. And that's kind of her initial response. And Mordecai says, this will affect you, Esther, because you are a Jew. And he says, you're going to be found out. And it's interesting, the confidence that Mordecai has that relief will come. Even though he doesn't mention God, you get the sense that he 100% believes that God is going to take care of them. He says, God will act, essentially. And he says, if she doesn't act, where will relief come from? Verse 14. Somewhere else. So he believes that God is going to take care of the Jewish people, that they're not going to be destroyed. But whether it's going to come from Esther or it's going to come from someone else is to be determined. So there, and then there's this great line of this passage, which really, I think, sums up the entire book of Esther and the whole point of Esther, which was, and who knows, but that you've come to your royal position for such a time as this. So Esther gets it. She asks Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa and have them fast for her. And she says she will fast. And then 3 days later, let's see what's going to happen. And I think it's interesting because to me, obviously, it must have been fasting and prayer go together. But I don't know why that's sort of left out of Esther. But we're going to assume that they were fasting and praying and petitioning God. So what happens when she approaches? Chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they're drinking wine, the king asked Esther again, "Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." So Esther approaches the king. He extends his scepter. He's pleased with her. It says that she can have anything she wants, up to half the kingdom. So she invites Xerxes and Haman to a feast. Xerxes asks her, "What do you want?" And Esther says, "Come to a feast tomorrow." And so Xerxes agrees. So following this, and I won't read the whole part, but Haman goes out and he sees Mordecai. And Mordecai, of course, doesn't bow down to him, right? And Haman gets like so stinking mad. He's so mad. He's just had this great feast, but he gets so mad that Mordecai will not bow down to him. So he goes home and he starts bragging to his wife and his friends about this great feast he's had. But he says in 5:13, "But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." And so the wife and friends tell Haman that he should have a pole set up to impale Mordecai on. And Haman thinks this is a great idea. And he's going to go to the king and ask permission. So that's kind of where we're going to pick up in our story. So picking up in chapter 6, verse 1. Okay. So that night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. "What honored recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in," the king ordered. So when Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe to the king. Royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.' Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse and do just as you've suggested for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Can you just see that? It's like, oh my gosh, this is what is done for the king the man delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife, Zeresh, said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. Okay, so I just love this, right? Isn't it just a great passage? What should be done for someone the king wants to honor? So, of course, Haman thinks what? That they're talking about who? Him, right, exactly. And so Haman comes up with what he would want the king to do for him, of course. But who's going to be honored? Mordecai. It's just great. And so, and why? Why does Mordecai need to be honored? What did he uncover? Right. He uncovered that plot about King Xerxes. So imagine the scene, just Haman leading Mordecai through the streets. I just think it is a fabulous scene. And he's yelling, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." I love it. So now I thought the comment of Zeresh, his wife, was something I needed to investigate a little bit more. So Haman's wife says, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." So I was like, what is going on with that? I didn't understand that. So what does that mean? So Haman is described as an Agagite, which is actually an Amalekite. Okay, so he's from Amalekite origin. So during the early conflict between Israel and the Amalekites, the Lord swears he will be at war with the Amalekites forever, from generation to generation. This happens during the desert wandering years of Israel. The Amalekites actually attack Israel. And if you can remember the story, it's a story where Moses has to hold up his staff. Do you kind of remember that story? There's that story where if he holds up his staff, then the Israel wins. And when his hands get tired and his staff goes down, then the Amalekites begin to prevail. And so Aaron and Hur sit him on a rock, right? And they're the ones that hold up the staff for him. And Israel is able to win the fight. So, and then from Exodus 17:15 through 16, it says, Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. So what's very interesting is that somehow Zeresh, his wife knows. So there must have been a very ongoing tension between Israel and the Amalekites from then on. So this reference goes back to that moment, which was interesting to me. So now we get to the second banquet with Esther, Xerxes, and Haman. I'll pick up our story, chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they're drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in rage, left his wine, and went into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king explained, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury was subsided. So Haman is impaled on the very same stake, right, that he had set up for Mordecai. Oh, the irony. So following this, Xerxes gives Haman's estate to Esther. She puts Mordecai in charge of it. And Esther pleads with Xerxes to change the law. But it's the laws of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. That's something that's like they cannot change their laws. If a law is a law, it's a law. So, but they realize that maybe they can write an additional law. And so that's going to be their new idea. So it says in the third day of the third month, the secretaries are called in by Mordecai to draft a new law. And this is what the law says. So Esther 8:11 through 13. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. Okay, so what does the law give the Jews the right to do? Defend themselves, exactly. So they can't erase the law, but what they can say is that on this day, the day that the Jews are to be annihilated, the Jews have the right to defend themselves. And what day does it say? It's the 13th day of the 12th month. So the very day that the law was to be enacted for them to be killed. Last little bit of scripture. So then what happens? So Esther 9, 1 through 5. So then what happens on this day? So on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in all their cities in the province of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them, because the peoples of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. So they ward off their annihilation. What's interesting about what does the text say about Mordecai in verse 4? What says he was what? He'd become prominent. So in the palace, his reputation spread. So Mordecai was promoted in the 3rd month. So this is the 12th month. So now we're 9 months later. So if you can imagine that in 9 months, Mordecai has grown very powerful in the government. It actually says that he rises to second in command. So if you can understand, like, nobody wants to cross him, right? So this is like the second guy in command who is now ruling under King Xerxes. So it says that the Jews do kill people who attack them, but most people don't because they're too afraid of Mordecai and his prominence in the government. So the book ends with establishing the holiday of Purim to be observed annually. So what have we seen today? So we saw God raise up a person into a position of power for the welfare of his own people. We saw this with Joseph and with Daniel, right? And now with Esther. From the story, is God in charge of governments and nations? Yeah, and that should be very comforting to us too. It's interesting how God placed Esther as the right person in the right place at the right time. And, she's described as incredibly beautiful, but she had to become queen. I just think it's so interesting how God made this woman, a very beautiful woman, and really was sort of the purpose that she would become queen, right? She had to be beautiful. God, a woman who was not beautiful would not have been taken into this position. So I started thinking about how God made her beautiful to bring about influence. And I thought that was really my mind started going that way. I thought that was interesting. And also noticing that she had been through a lot of hardship. I mean, she lost her parents. She was an orphan. She was being raised by her cousin. So it wasn't necessarily that her life had been easy. She was part of the Jewish people, which were probably the underdogs. God had a great plan to use her in a great way. And that key line is, and who knows that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So I started thinking, how do we apply this to our own lives? And I think we can all consider, what skills and gifts has God given me? To all of us, where has he placed me? How can he use me? Because God put her in all these positions. So where are you? What positions are you in? What influence do you have? What is sort of your time, your place? We believe God intricately works in all of our lives as if we were his only child, as if he loved us only. He works that intimately in our lives. 2 summers ago, when I was at Forest Home, one of the speakers talked about the life of Moses all week long, and it was just great. And he really remarked on that period in Moses' life where for 40 years, he's in the desert just tending sheep. And he gets married, and he has sons, and he's just tending sheep. And we don't get the sense that he's unhappy. He's just tending sheep. And the point of the pastor was that Moses was just faithful with where he was in the desert, tending sheep, getting married, having sons, and that the pastor's challenge to us was to be present where you are, and that when God wants you to change, if God wants something different in your life, he's going to show up in a burning bush. And so just like he did to Moses. So his point was be present, bless where you are. What position are you in that you can bless? Just who you are in your normal life, in the daily things around you. And I really love that. That was a challenge to me. So, and that if God has something else, he's going to show up and he's going to tell you what else he has for you. And Pastor Paul put this great quote up on this screen on Sunday morning. He said, this is by Friedrich Buchner. He said, the place where God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So that each of us were gifted, were called. Each of you were made as amazing, unique women called by the Lord. God has given me this funny gift of loving the Bible and wanting to teach it. But that's my gift, That's not your gifts. Each of you have amazing ways that you bless and encourage and love those around you. So I love that. So a couple of questions for those of you who can chat for a few minutes. If you are sitting with a friend by you, I would say, I encourage you, tell your friend the way you have seen God gift her. Because I think sometimes we don't like to talk about our own gifts, but we see them in each other, right? So if you're sitting with a friend, talk about the way that God has gifted her. Number two, if you feel that God is speaking to you through this study, share with a friend what God is speaking to you. If you feel like there's an area that God is telling you to be influential. And then finally, share any prayer requests you have for this week. Thank you, ladies. It's been fun to study Esther with you.